Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
A note off the top, this week's episode involves discussion around the internet and sexual abuse, and it may not be suitable for young kids to hear, so we want to let you know listener and viewer discretion is advised. We're welcoming a returning guest to the show this week for a conversation tied to something that's been brewing for years amongst Americans in the modern digital era, and that is what social media and the internet era is doing or allowing for, especially when it comes to kids.
Yeah, well, concern about what's happening on these platforms is widespread. New Mexico now has a big role in it. Last December, our state's Attorney General Raul Torres made headlines for filing a lawsuit in New Mexico's state court against Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram. Broadly, that lawsuit claims Meta's platforms are hot spots for predators looking to trade child pornography and solicit minors for sex.
So then in September, Torres' office also filed another lawsuit, this time against Snapchat's owner. That lawsuit partly claims that the app is a primary platform where criminals carry out sextortion and for sharing of child sex abuse material, or something that's called CSAM. While those two lawsuits are pending, the AG's office also helped lead a sting in October, netting a handful of accused predators across a handful of social media sites.
Yeah, so what's behind these lawsuits and these sting operations? Will they make a meaningful difference? We have Attorney General Raul Torres here joining us in the digital studio to talk about it. AG Torres, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so all of this recent activity, the sting as well as the continued lawsuits, it might feel like to some people, and I say this with just a little bit of tongue-in-cheek nature to this, but it may feel like Raul Torres versus the internet. I imagine you may feel a little bit differently about that kind of phrase. That may be a little bit more of a exaggerating on my part, but just to ask you at a high level, what is the goal here of these lawsuits?
Fundamentally, the goal is to get these technology companies and social media companies to completely change the way they do business, specifically with respect to how they build their platforms in such a way that they facilitate sexual predation of children. And they have known for quite some time, and we have uncovered through the course of our investigation and through the litigation that we have filed, that both Meta and Snap have been aware of a pretty persistent problem that they've had, in that the platforms have not only become a place where there is behavior that arises in children that impacts their psychology, that leads to higher rates of anxiety and depression, that has an adverse impact, especially on young girls, on their self-image. These are harms that they have known about for quite some time, but there is an even more disturbing aspect of the platforms in that it has become the primary place for child predators to identify, groom, target, and potentially victimize children, not just in New Mexico, but around the world.
And I understand you've spent a good portion in your career as a prosecutor specializing in internet crimes against children. There appears to be more investment from local and federal agencies to address this problem. But from your perspective and your background with cases like this, has the problem gotten worse?
Well, the problem has not only gotten worse, but it has evolved in a way that takes advantage of some of the new technology that frankly wasn't available and wasn't part of the world that I knew when I was a young internet crimes against children prosecutor. I have the distinction, I think, of being the only person to serve now as Attorney General who started off earlier in their career as a line assistant Attorney General, and what that in that particular role, I was responsible for identifying people who were trafficking in child sexual exploitation and sexual abuse material, child pornography, but also people who were using technology to try and meet up with and target children in the real world. Now, when I was doing that work, nearly 20 years ago, there weren't smartphones, there weren't social media applications, and a lot of the work that we did as investigators and prosecutors had us focused on peer-to-peer sites on the internet and a whole different network that was available. But the real way to think about it is that back then, people who had a sexual interest in children really were off in the dark corners of the internet. They were on sites and in these network spaces that were pretty obscure and hard to find. What has changed is that most of that activity has now migrated to some of the biggest and well-known social media platforms anywhere in the world. These are platforms and applications that are readily available on, the Google Store, on the App Store, and can be downloaded on devices with just the touch of a button. And what we are revealing, I think, in the course of this litigation is just how easy it is with this new technology for some of the most dangerous people in our society to have direct access to children. And one of the things that we're trying to do, in addition to just fundamentally getting these companies to change their behavior, is to get the public, particularly parents, to understand just how dangerous this is and how the things that we worry about aren't just limited to virtual or digital interactions and some kind of inappropriate content that may be shared or a solicitation that may come over the phone. It's the very real possibility that can turn into a real world encounter and physically endanger their children. And that's why we have paired the civil litigation strategy with very focused criminal investigations. We did Operation Metafile earlier this year. We did Operation Overwatch just a couple weeks ago. Both of those were meant to highlight not only the criminal aspect of this investigation, but frankly to highlight the fact that if parents and educators and adults aren't more vigilant about these digital spaces, that it can turn into a physical encounter and a dangerous real-world encounter with just the click of a button.
I wanted to drill a little bit more into these lawsuits here because from what I read, each one of them strikes at a few different things. But let's start with that ongoing litigation against Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. It's been almost a year since your office filed that litigation. What is the point of that specific lawsuit?
The lawsuit that we filed is different from the lawsuit that was joined by more than 40 other attorneys general. I have peers across the country who were primarily focused on the psychological effect. They were primarily focused on the addictive nature of the platform itself and the increase in anxiety and depression and those sorts of issues. We have articulated some of those same harms in our lawsuit, but I think in part because of my background as a frontline prosecutor, we wanted to dig in more into sexual exploitation and sexual predation. And the way in which we went about building this case and initiating the lawsuit sort of brings together techniques that we have used and I have used in the criminal context and utilized it in the form of civil litigation. So what we did is, using artificial intelligence, we actually created a decoy account where an undercover officer, a middle-aged man, is a special agent in our office, was actually transformed into what users on the platforms believed was an underage girl. And she was presented on the platform in such a way that it was very clear and very obvious that she was underage, despite the fact that the platform has limitations, or is supposed to have limitations on who's there and who's allowed to use these spaces. It's also pretty obvious, and we allege in the lawsuit, that there is no real age verification. And what that first and foremost demonstrates is that the company has known and actually has built its business model around the idea that underage users are there, and they understand that if they can cultivate real engagement over a lifetime, there is real monetary value in terms of marketing to young users, goods and services and products that young girls in particular might be interested in using. But what they have also known is that this is a space that attracts the worst of the worst, sexual predators. And we confirmed that because once these decoy accounts were live, there was an absolute explosion in the number of followers that she had. It grew, in fact, so dramatically that Meta reached out to her, and rather than shutting down the account or raising some red flags about why are all these grown men following your account, they actually sent her a notice about how she could convert the page into a commercial page and monetize her following, and actually build on and expand the group of individuals who are overwhelmingly men, middle-aged men from not only the United States but all over the world, how she could market to those men. And what that reveals is just this absolute disregard, from my perspective, on the part of these executives who have placed and prioritized engagement and growth and revenue streams over the basics of child safety. And what that sort of brought to light is what Facebook and Meta has known for quite some time, and it's this. Based on their own internal communications, nearly 100,000 children every single day receive sexually explicit material or solicitations for sex or some other form of sexual harassment every day. And they also are aware that the same algorithm, the same architecture that will link, one individual with a particular type of activity or goods or services that they may like, that same technology facilitates and actually amplifies the ability of predators to find, locate, and target these children. In other words, the value in these companies is in building a digital profile of a particular user, and then based on that profile, understanding, well, you might like a particular pair of sneakers, or you might be interested in a certain type of vacation, or you might like this good or service. Well, the same algorithm that matches your digital profile with those totally mundane goods and services also serves to match someone who has a sexual interest in children with children that the platform itself knows are in these spaces. And they have failed fundamentally to take basic precautionary steps to ensure child safety. The reason we know that is we have uncovered numerous internal documents from trust and safety experts inside the company itself who have warned senior executives for years that this was going on. And repeatedly, there was a pattern of conduct inside the company where, when presented with this evidence and information from their own trust and safety people, they prioritized engagement, they prioritized money over child safety. So fundamentally, what we're trying to do is change that behavior, change the way they do business, and do so in a way that, acknowledges the fact that these are spaces where children are present, and if we don't do more to protect them, they're going to be victimized, and this company is responsible because of the business practices that they've engaged in.
And I understand there were months of undercover work before this filing, and you mentioned some of the findings that you guys found, but can you share with us, what evidence was it that you were presented with where you felt like, okay, I have enough to back up these claims against Facebook and Instagram?
Well, we had access, like I said, to the internal documents that talked about the sort of system-wide problems, the platform-wide issues that had been identified by their own people, but we wanted to test that for ourselves. And the decoy account that we established confirmed exactly what their own trust and safety people were talking about, to the point where this decoy account was receiving solicitations for sex, requests to meet up in person, offers to engage in exchange in sexually explicit material, and it was happening at such a speed and with such volume that had this been, a real child who either didn't have the kind of supervision that we need in these spaces, there was a risk that person would have been in real danger. And we have had real life examples in New Mexico and across the country where predators have identified and targeted these kids. They've gone to these places to go and find them. And, the way to think about it is, predators of this kind have always been present in our society, but they would have to linger around schools. They would go to parks. They would physically go to places where children were in some way available to them as targets of opportunity that they could potentially exploit. Now they can do that through the phone, through their social media applications, and sadly, through devices that parents themselves have provided to young people, not realizing that what they're handing them is actually a window that enables exploitation.
Can you give us another idea of just how prevalent do you think that this illicit content is on these platforms?
Well, it's really difficult for us to nail down the volume. Again, that the estimate of 100,000 children receiving material or solicitations globally every day doesn't come from us. It comes from Meta. It comes from their own internal assessment. And this is something that we are now confirming with a separate program that we're doing called Smart Chats. We're actually going to school districts across the state, working with parent associations, working with educators, and we are doing listening sessions with high schoolers and middle schoolers in the state. And we're asking them, what kind of experience? Tell us about the kinds of experience you've had on these various platforms. And without exception, when we start talking to children and young adults about their experience online, they are routinely reporting that someone has sent them an inappropriate image, genitalia, a request for a sexual image, a request to meet up with them. It's happening all the time. In fact, the kind of sad aspect of this, the thing that's been kind of enlightening for me as a parent, kids are actually more aware of this than parents are. Children that are using social media applications routinely, they kind of view this as the price of being on the applications. It's just there. It's just part of their experience. It's the parents who are shocked when they find out that, my 14 or 15-year-old or my 12-year-old has been receiving this information. A lot of times kids are moving through it, but not all. And some are actually falling into these traps where they're meeting up with these predators in real life.
I understand one of the big sticking points as well in this lawsuit is the failure of Meta to remove child sex abuse material. Can you describe that problem? How does that work, and what are your investigators aware of in terms of the removal of this stuff?
Right. Well, and I will say, and I do want to credit some of the social media applications and platforms, including Meta. To a certain extent, they do report images to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That is absolutely true. The question is how much of it is going unreported, how much of it is going unidentified. And the problem is both a technological problem, but it's really a manpower issue. Most people don't realize that a lot of these big social media applications, they outsource content moderation to other third-party companies. Some of these third-party providers are out of the country. They have limited access to some of the data streams. They have limited resources. But even if they were, fully resourced, there is so much volume and so much traffic. If you think about how many posts are on these platforms on any given day and any given moment, it's virtually impossible, right, to be able to detect this without fundamentally altering the way that the platform is structured and the algorithms are structured. From real life age verification, which I think is, if you boiled it down to one of the most significant issues, is knowing fundamentally the age of the person who is on the other end of this device and setting very strict parameters around who could communicate with that person and what types of materials they might be able to see. Those are some of the things that we're trying to see implemented if we're successful in the lawsuit. It's re-engineering the way that the platform itself works.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
And I know that the idea, generally speaking, of regulating social media platforms comes back also to the idea of freedom of speech, right? To some extent, defining what is harmful content and then taking on a responsibility to remove that content or even aid authorities in finding criminals online, predators online. In these cases that you've dealt with, do you see these companies wanting to crack down on this type of activity on their platforms, or is it, like you said, just a manpower too difficult to keep up with?
Well, look, we a lot of times people don't recognize how a particular legal framework enables corporate cultures and corporate products to develop in very particular ways. And in order to fully understand why we are where we are, you have to go all the way back to the late 1990s, right? To 1996, 97, we passed the Communications Decency Act in Congress. And remember, this is the very earliest days of the internet. And at that time, Congress was concerned about promoting the internet economy and enabling a space for that economy to flourish. And so one of the critical decisions that they made, and from my perspective, a critical mistake that was made, was the implementation and passage of something that's called Section 230. So Section 230 effectively says that people who manage internet sites like this will not be responsible for the content that is posted by third parties, right? By the activity engaged in by third parties. And what that did is it immunized them from any liability for any of the types of really harmful conduct that we now see manifesting. But you have to remember, this was a time when, I was still waiting for a dial-up tone on my desktop to access the internet. We were thinking about Craigslist and MySpace and lots of things that have kind of faded away. We were talking about message boards and posting information about my bike being for sale or something like that. There was no smartphone. There were no social media applications. None of this technology existed or was even contemplated, much less the volume and speed and pace at which all of this information and material was exchanged, not just within the country, but around the world. And what we have seen, I think, is Congress trying to promote and support this fledgling economy. And now these global behemoths who have limitless resources to deploy lawyers, lobbyists, and others using their market power to lock in a legal framework that was developed at a time and place where we barely understood what the internet economy was going to become. And that's a real problem. It's the way in which the speed and pace of legal reform and change has not matched the speed and pace of technological innovation, right? And one of the things I have tried to do both here but at a national level is to encourage policymakers both in Santa Fe but in Washington, D.C. also, to understand that they need to be more agile when it comes to technological regulation and the pieces that we put in place. And we need to be able to adapt more quickly to evolving technology. Otherwise, your legal framework doesn't match the context that you find yourself in. And that's exactly where we found ourselves now.
It's been a year since the Meta lawsuit was filed. Have they responded, and where does the case stand today?
So we are pursuing litigation, and we're at the point now where we're engaged in discovery, right? We're asking for answers to specific questions, gathering more information. We will eventually engage in depositions of executives. One of the key early victories for our lawsuit was to withstand a motion to dismiss specifically on the basis of Section 230. So one of the first things they did was try to get the lawsuit thrown out of court, saying, we have no liability under Section 230 and you can't hold us responsible. The district court in Santa Fe rejected that argument, and we're one of the few states in the country to actually have prevailed in our argument, in part because we are focused on not just the third-party content published by other individuals or the third-party activity of other individuals, but the specific decisions that Meta itself has made about the design features. In other words, we are pursuing a strategy that focuses very much on the idea that this is a dangerous product, a product that has been misrepresented to the public. And while Facebook may have some immunity for the criminal activity and actions of other people on their space, they do not have immunity for misrepresentations that they've made or omissions that they've made, which is also why we've been very supportive of the Surgeon General's call for labeling these types of products. It's something that happened early in the fight against tobacco when, you can see the parallels pretty quickly. A known addictive, dangerous product is intentionally marketed to children without disclosing the potential harms. One of the things we did in that first fight over tobacco was to force the industry to label right on the top, hey, this is a product that could harm or kill you. Imagine, the psychological impact for parents and for others that every time they pick up a phone, they've got a new phone, they've handed it to some young person in their household, and they click on, downloading one of these apps, something pops up and says, by the way, mom or dad or whoever's in charge of providing this phone, did you know that this is dangerous to children? Did you know that the thing you're about to download and make available on their phone is something that could actually lead to these specific harms? And while lots of people look at those labels as not being particularly effective, it's part of a larger movement to educate people about the harms that are associated with the products.
Let's talk a little bit about that lawsuit that you also have pending against Snap Inc. That's the parent company of Snapchat. It seems to be a little bit more directed at how that app is designed in its individual sense, or the algorithm, which you said in a press release, quote, fosters the sharing of child sex abuse material and facilitates child sexual exploitation. How do you see that lawsuit as different from the one that's Meta is facing?
Well, let's start with what's similar. What is similar is the fact that the company knows that, A, there are children on their platform and predators on their platform. So they've known that and have been aware of that for quite some time. What makes Snap different from Meta, however, is the fact that they have marketed themselves as a place that is, because of certain design features, makes it safer for kids potentially to share sexually explicit material. In other words, Snap is sort of predicated on the notion of what we call ephemeral content that a photo or a video or something like that can be shared, but that will disappear, right? That's the allure, and that has always been sort of its marketing advantage as compared to other social media platforms. But what the company knows, what predators know, and a lot of parents and children don't seem to understand is whether you think that content is going to disappear, it's actually easily captured. There are certain ways to capture those images and those files, and that's what makes it so dangerous for a different type of harm, and that's sextortion. And for people who don't know what that is, it's a form of extortion that involves tricking a young person into sending, personal and oftentimes graphic images of themselves, thinking that you are sharing it with a girl or a boy that may have an interest in you and you're sharing an intimate photo. It turns out it's a criminal organization on the other side of the world, or it's a criminal maybe in your own community, and they turn around and say, we now have this image of you. We need you to send us this amount of crypto or this amount of money, or we're going to send it to your school. We're going to send it to your football team. We're going to share it with the people closest to you, and you will be mortified and embarrassed. And what is so tragic about this conduct is that we have had a number of young people, including young boys, adolescent men and boys who have been caught up in these schemes, who have committed suicide because they are so ashamed, because they are worried that these images will be shared with people in their lives. And not unlike Meta, Snap has known, and by its own account, I think receives something on the order of 10,000 reports a month of sextortion, and they believe that to be a low number. So that is the scale of the problem in Snap. It's a little bit different than Meta, but again, the defense is the same, right? Because Congress granted immunity under Section 230, they should be held harmless for all of this type of activity. And fundamentally, we are again trying to get them to change the way they have organized their business and change the way they deliver content and facilitate communications on the platform.
Can you share with us a little bit about what your agents found when building the case against Snapchat?
Using basically a similar approach. We once again used decoy accounts. And those decoy accounts were pretty quickly inundated with requests for images, the types of images that would be at the center of a pretty typical sextortion scheme. We, in both the Meta filing, but also in the Snap filing, we actually had to spend a good deal of time scrubbing the content of the information that we received, because these are public filings. And we want to give the court and the public a sense of what we're dealing with. But one of the things that's most shocking is I actually get to see the unredacted version of the original complaint, and it is horrific in terms of the types of interactions that people are engaging with, the types of images that they're trading or asking to have traded. But at the same time, we also had access in Snap to these internal communications about the fact that, once again, people in the trust and safety department are raising red flags to executives in the company, and people choosing to prioritize engagement. One of the things that we uncovered in the Snap case is, an internal communication that talked about how they should warn, or if they should warn, parents and the public about what was going on. And there was some discussion about, well, no, we shouldn't, because we don't want to scare people away. And again, it goes to this idea of having complete knowledge about how dangerous a product could potentially be for the most vulnerable members of our community, and making an affirmative choice to disregard those dangers and just move forward with the development of applications that we know to be harmful and we know to be dangerous. We anticipate in Snap to get a version of the same motion that we saw in Meta. We're hopeful that we will have the same kind of outcome, because we are very much focused on their own conduct. But again, we are trying to highlight for policymakers in DC the urgent need to either strike Section 230 or dramatically amend it so that these people can be held accountable. My own personal belief, as somebody who's not only been a prosecutor, but I was a technology executive, I worked in a technology company before I went to law school, I think we have to stop thinking about these things in a different way. And what I mean by that is, imagine for a moment that we weren't talking about social media applications. Imagine that in this community there was a warehouse, a physical space, and in that warehouse people could come in on a daily basis, and there were stalls, and in those stalls there were children available for sexual exploitation. There were images for sale. and people were physically showing up, predators were showing up to try and target children, find children, and exploit them, we wouldn't be having a conversation about me filing a civil action. You and members of this community would demand that we show up with police officers with badges and guns and handcuffs, that we would take everyone into custody, and we would also immediately start inquiring about whether or not the owner of that building knew what was going on and was profiting off of what was going on. And if we could prove that, and if we knew it, we wouldn't be having a conversation about the First Amendment, about expression. We wouldn't be talking about business owners and their liability. I would criminally prosecute that person. For some reason, because somebody's going to work in Menlo Park and wearing a hoodie to work and wearing sneakers and they have a computer science degree from Stanford, we're supposed to treat them differently. We're supposed to treat them or hold them to a lower level of accountability. I don't think people accept that. And I think they are really attuned to the idea that we have to have accountability in this space, because it isn't just one warehouse in one city. It is a global warehouse, open 24/7, 365, available to everyone on this planet. And if you think about it at that level and at that scale, I think that really goes to, a sense of urgency that we have encountered on the part of advocates, on the part of educators, and most importantly, on the part of parents who have either had their child taken from them because of suicide or have witnessed their child be the victim of exploitation in the real world. They are struggling to understand why these companies and their executives are treated differently than everyone else in our society when it comes to this behavior.
Covered a lot of ground, but Meta and Snap, these are some of the largest internet companies in the world. As you mentioned, you're, one attorney general here in New Mexico fighting against these very powerful entities. How confident are you that you can, or these lawsuits will make a difference?
I fundamentally believe that if we are able to have our day in court, as people say, right, in front of 12 honest people from chosen from Santa Fe County to sit in judgment and hear all of the evidence that we have collected and all of the information that we have about the conduct of the leaders in this company, I have every expectation that the people in that community are going to find this company liable and reach a conclusion that they are not only financially liable, but they must change the way they do business. I don't have any illusions about the fact that a single victory in a single state is going to, in and of itself, change everything that needs to be changed in this space. But I think it will send a powerful message to those corporations that they can't act with impunity, that they can't disregard their ethical obligation to engage in business practices that places child safety at the center of what they do. And I think it will be an important milestone in the history of law and technology in this country, where we hold them to the same basic standards of conduct that we hold other business owners to, that we hold other members of our community to. And I think over the long term, if we are successful here, we will see other lawsuits and other actions taken both in states in the United States and in municipalities around the country, but in other parts of the world, and that the collective weight of all of those actions will ultimately change the behavior. And I think if you take a broad historical look, whether it's pharmaceutical companies who have marketed dangerous substances, and for example, opioids, or big tobacco, or chemical companies that have engaged in business practices that place people at risk. Sometimes it happens in a short period of time. Sometimes it takes a little while. But there is always a tipping point in society when people become aware of the nature and scale of a particular type of harm, where they demand a change. And we have already seen, since we filed our action, a number of steps that Meta itself has taken. I mean, they have released more safety updates and modifications to their platform in the last year than I think they did in the previous 5 or 10. And that's, I think, is a direct result of not just our action, but the collective action of attorneys general across the country, putting them on notice that despite a lack of momentum at the congressional level, we are prepared to go to court. And when we take these types of steps, it's going to impact their bottom line. And if they are not going to be motivated by their own moral or ethical compass, they will be motivated by that. And we are prepared to go as long and face any obstacle that we have to make sure that they change their behavior.
To the point that you made about some of those changes, one of those being Instagram, they recently launched teen accounts, which includes automatic, as they call them, protections, to help shield teens from sensitive content and interactions from people they may not know. Meta also has launched a big marketing blitz for this fall. You can see a lot of TV ads out there right now. One of them uses language saying, quote, "You've always looked out for them. We're here to do it with you." I was curious your thoughts. I mean, we know it's marketing, right? That's designed to make people feel a way. But that really stuck out to me because I think that, just even reading the filings, whether it's against Meta or Snap, and you take the issue broadly, I would say that you probably fundamentally disagree with this idea of we're here to do it for you because, at least according to your filings, they haven't been doing it for years. What is your take on when you see that type of marketing? You obviously have noticed there is a shift here.
If these companies could be counted on to do the right thing, I wouldn't have had to file the lawsuit, and we wouldn't be where we are today. So I don't think they really have any credibility. I think people can see those ads and that marketing for what it is, which is too little, too late, and an investment in covering up the sins of the past. What they should be doing, instead of paying marketing teams and PR executives and lawyers and lobbyists, if instead they just took all of that money, empowered their own trust and safety people, brought in the best and the brightest and smartest people that they have in those companies, and said, we are going to reset the terms of this platform predicated on child safety first, we would solve this problem. But the challenge is they're only going to do the right thing when they're forced to do it. And I just think that they know, at least the more astute members of their executive team know, that they have a long-term, potentially existential crisis on their hands. Because, again, in the social context and in the marketplace, dynamics change. Things happen slowly and then all at once, right? Things hit a tipping point in society, and they hit a tipping point in marketplaces. And if the parents in this country collectively start to become more and more aware of how dangerous these spaces are, then their own business model begins to collapse. And unfortunately, what we see in those marketing campaigns is an investment in trying to kind of dress up and give themselves credit for things that, frankly, they could have done 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but they didn't do until they got sued. My sense of this is that Congress gets rid of Section 230, and they are hit with a massive financial judgment and an order, an injunctive order from a court telling them to redesign how this works. You're going to see the functionality of these platforms change quite quickly. And the only thing I would say, if Mark Zuckerberg was here, is nothing is stopping you from doing that right now. Take all the money you're spending on marketing and all the money you're spending on lawyers and lobbyists, put it into making this the safe product. Full stop. But again, you're seeing a marketing campaign that doesn't match their actions. And let me give you one really big example. one of the things that we were able to identify is the way in which the messenger application on the platforms is actually one of the primary tools for communications between strangers and adults. And part of the reason we know that is because the company itself had access to the communications. It actually could see, under the terms of service, all of the communications that were going on. Most of it between people that just, were old friends. We talked to one another. But there was a certain amount of those of communications between adults, strangers, and children where you could see very dangerous things going on. The day after we filed our lawsuit, Meta announced that it was going to end-to-end encryption. It was intentionally blinding itself to all of the communications. And the way they talked about it was, well, this is for privacy purposes. This is so that you can have some sense and some peace of mind that your communications aren't open for us to see. Why did they do it the day after we filed a lawsuit where we highlighted the fact that adults were talking to children? I believe it's because they wanted to wash their hands and say, we're now intentionally blinding ourselves to this channel. What they did not do is say, at that moment, no more communications with children of any kind, period. No more. If you want to use Messenger, you have to show us that you're 18 and older. They could have done that, right? But they didn't. Well, instead, they encrypted all those communications. And that's why I think people look at this and they just have a healthy sense of skepticism when it comes to whether or not these people are actually putting the best interests of their users first.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Anything else we're missing that you want to add or want, parents to be informed of?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the things that we are attempting to do with this is obviously change the way they do business and find legal remedies in the courtroom. But that's not going to do what we need. In other words, the reason we were able to get to a different place in this society when it comes to lung cancer and the health effects associated with tobacco is because we collectively started to think about it differently. I think you're going to think about this in much the same way. If you go back and you look at movies or ads from the 40s and 50s and 60s, I mean, everyone's smoking. Right. They're smoking on the planes. They're smoking on the trains.
Cartoon characters.
Everybody, there's cartoon characters that are smoking, right? I mean, we're intentionally marketing it to children. Doctors are smoking. They literally had ads from, doctors about like, this is the best brand of cigarette. You look at those ads now with modern eyes, and it's like baffling to us. I have a sense that 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, the next generation is going to look back at the way in which we marketed to children, the way in which adults handed to children a device that I think is inherently dangerous with little or no safeguards, and you are going to be appalled by it because in the intervening period, there's going to be such a revelation, not only about predation, but anxiety and depression and the like. And the reason that I want people to think about it now is, if nothing else, parents listening to this need to stop for a moment. If they have given their child a device, they need to sit down with that child, go through that device. What applications are they on? How are they using it? How are they using it to communicate with people? Who are they in touch with? What information is there? And if they haven't done that, they need to. Because I can tell you that from all of my interactions with the parents, no one thinks it's going to be them until it is. Everyone thinks, well, that's someone else's child who's going to commit suicide. That's someone else's child who's going to fall prey to some sexual predator. And that's not the case, right? So it starts with us. It starts with community leaders, educators, but most importantly with parents, being a lot more aware and a lot more engaged in this space.
Attorney General Raul Torres, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, thanks for your time. Again, thanks to Raul Torres, the New Mexico Attorney General, for joining us for this conversation. And we should note that Meta has denied claims that its platform puts children at risk. They did file an attempt to get their lawsuit dismissed, but so far that has failed, I think, as the Attorney General mentioned. Snap put out a statement in October, and that said, in part, we care deeply about our work here, and it pains us when bad actors abuse our service. They also said, quote, they continue to evolve new safety mechanisms and policies.
And this summer, as AG Torres mentioned, the U.S. Surgeon General also called on Congress to require warning labels about social media effects on young people on social media platforms, similar to those that we do see on cigarette boxes. But that would require congressional action, and so far it's not clear if that will happen. So,
yeah,
to be determined.
Much to be determined in these two cases, and it'll be fascinating to pay attention to how things evolve over time. If you have an idea, let us know. I'm at chris.mckee@krqe.com or also at Chris McKee TV.
And I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart at krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. You can see this full extended conversation on our KRQE YouTube channel and on krqe.com/podcasts. Thank you all for listening and watching.